As a union of not just states, but of several linguistically diverse peoples, it is unsurprising that disputes over languages have a long history in India. Mass protests and brutal riots were witnessed during the decades after the independence as states were slowly reorganized on linguistic lines. While some languages initially overlooked by the constitution won their battle for official recognition, others gave up and perished, and some still continue to fight. BJP, the Hindu Nationalist Party, currently in power at the center, is accused of pushing for Hindi imperialism. However, the debate over national language predates them by over a century. Many of India's leading independence leaders, including Mahatma Gandhi, were in favor of linguistic unification and ending the dominance of English, the language of the colonizers. The unified language Mahatma Gandhi had endorsed was not Hindi, but Hindustani, the language of Indian nationalism and freedom struggle. He believed it would be a more secular choice, fusing Urdu and Hindi into one. Secular it may have been, but it surely wasn't inclusive of vast swaths of Indians in the South and the East. And now the case for Hindustani is all but dead, with many Indians coming to see Urdu as a non-Indian language. On the other hand, English has gone from success to success. While understood by a tiny portion of the urban elite at the time of the independence and limited to official use only, in the past 75 years, English has penetrated into almost all spheres of Indian life and percolated down to its remote towns and villages. After seeing its economic value, most Indians are now loath to give up English, but a small faction still hopes for a national linked language of Indian origin. But any discussion on it rapidly descends into repugnant language chauvinism. Tamil is the oldest language, Bengali is the sweetest language, those who don't know Hindi cannot be Indians, and more such trite statements are commonly thrown around. Away from all this noise, we decided to explore the very origins and the evolution of Indian languages. Is Sanskrit truly the mother of Indian languages, as we are told? At what point did Indian languages break away from Sanskrit and acquire their own distinct identities of Bengali, Marathi, Punjabi? Why some languages such as Tamil survived over millennia while others like Sanskrit died? Should dying languages be protected? And can a dead language such as Sanskrit be brought back to life? What makes a language Indian or non-Indian? Is it the origins of its vocabulary, or the number of speakers, or the volume of literature? And finally, looking forward, should we expect a re-emergence of long suppressed regional tongues such as Bhojpuri, Tullu, and Haryanvi, or a gradual supplantation of even the larger languages such as Gujarati and Kannada by ever-expanding English? To address this and many related questions, we have with us one of India's top linguists, Dr. Peggy Mohan. She has earned her PhD in linguistics from the University of Michigan. She's taught at Jawaharlal Nehru University and Jamia Millia, among other prestigious centers. She's currently the visiting professor of linguistics at Ashoka University and is the author of the highly acclaimed Wanderers, Kings, Merchants, the Story of India Through Its Languages. Dr. Mohan, welcome to Augmentative Indians.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So it's a fascinating topic, and there's so much that we want to explore with you. But let's start from the beginning. How did languages we now see as Indian languages start to emerge? Is it like the commonly told story to us is that everybody at some point in the past, really ancient past, was speaking Sanskrit or something of the sort, and then it all got corrupted and people were not speaking it right, and here we are with Gujarati, Marathi, Bengali, Punjabi. But is that what it was?
Not quite like that. We go back a much further distance than Sanskrit. Sanskrit we think of as being here for about 3,700 years. There were languages before that. there were people in India, Homo sapiens, for the last about 65,000 years. That's a huge amount of time, and those people were speaking. So there's a lot that we have to try to uncover, and much that we probably can't uncover, and just as well, because it would have as much confusion as, I can't imagine India was very different back then, that every village would have had its own dialect, and there would have been a lot of variation and change going on. So we only managed to pick up the story around the time of Sanskrit and Tamil in the south, because they left something behind. In the case of Sanskrit, it was the Rig Veda, which was not written. So that's our earliest record of their language. But there was something before that. Obviously, you can't have cities and a huge economy and trade in the Indus Valley without these people speaking. And if it's an empire, or at any rate a civilization, there'd have been variety. I'm very curious about that. And it's very hard to find out, but we have ways of looking into the past. So Sanskrit was there, and then it's a longish story after that. As more and more people started speaking Sanskrit or speaking Prakrits as well, and these are the elite only, we only hear about the elite in history mostly, they began to feel irritated with it. Too many verbs, too many things to keep track of. It didn't sound like how we think of language. They started mucking around with it. And at some point in the 10th or 12th century, let's say 10th, we started finding a different set of people leaving written evidence, the written record. Because when you're talking of the 10th century, we can't go back and hear them. We have to see what they left. And so the question is, what did it happen in the 10th century? We have to say maybe, because that's the time when we have evidence for, but it could have happened even before that. But sometime around then in India and in Europe, you started seeing people who were not Brahmins and kings, or in Europe, priests and kings, starting to write, merchants, town people, and they were writing in something different, and their subject matter was different. So we suddenly see a new thing coming up, urban behavior among people who might have previously been villagers. So that is something of a hiccup in the history. It happened quickly, I would say. It is not a gradual thing. We suddenly found that something about the politics, about the atmosphere in the 10th to 12th centuries, and we know that there was the Bhakti movement happening, Buddhists were being phased out in maybe violent ways. We were seeing a big change happening, and that change was marked by language. And those languages were coming up locally, but whatever was written was not that far off from what we speak now.
So there was some sort of democratization of the writing going on. And
I wouldn't say it was democratization, because democracy is a very clear political thing. What started happening, but yes, the kind of writing that and storytelling that was monopolized by kings and Brahmins, edicts, religious mythology, religious discourse, that gave way to people who were writing accounts, who were writing legal things, who were writing lists, and just leaving very secular prose type stuff. Because all of a sudden, something must have changed in the economy. They needed to write things down. They had become a bit more prominent. Craftspeople, tradesmen, towns were coming up in a way. So this marked a change.
Found inscriptions, or we have like, where were they writing?
They would be writing in ledgers, there'll be not inscriptions, not stone inscriptions. The stone things are Ashoka and Prakrit era kings. But let's see, I can put it in a different way. We have Sanskrit. Sanskrit is essentially a Brahminical thing, and Prakrit not very different from it initially. It's like your English does not sound like the English of someone speaking in Oxford, but it doesn't matter because we're not listening to each other, we're writing. But in those days, people weren't writing. So the first thing that hit you was the accent, and the accent probably had a lot more local features, Dravidian features in it. And they said, oh, this is not Sanskrit, this is Prakrit. But do remember that the Prakrit was not spoken by the little people. It was spoken by elites who had access to the Brahmins, and later on to rulers who the Brahmins wanted to have a relationship with. So the importance of the Brahmins was they gave this Vedic endorsement to a bunch of people who were essentially local, who were kings. And that's how things worked. What we don't have in that is this huge gap of what were poor people and ordinary people talking. My suspicion is, and why not? You'd have to prove me wrong, that they could not have changed very much from the time before Sanskrit came. So we don't know when the last speakers of Indus Valley languages stopped speaking them, but I suspect it was much later, much more recently than we normally think. It's just that they were not writing, so we don't have access to them, to what they were saying. So always remember the Sanskrit and the Prakrits were extremely elite languages.
But see, that's interesting that you says Prakrit was an elite language, because the general understanding is that Buddhism and Jainism were movements that challenged the Brahmanical orthodoxy, and hence the rejection of Sanskrit. They're choosing to write their scriptures in Prakrits, like Pali in case of Buddhism and
Ardhamagadi, yeah,
in case of Jainism. Then the idea is that they were trying to reach the common people who did not. So is that view not correct? And then if Prakrit was not the language of the common people, then why did Ashoka choose to write his edicts in Prakrit if he was not trying to reach the common people?
This is something I've not completely figured out, and it's something that my students and I have been talking heatedly about. Ashoka, Mahavira, and the Buddha were on the other side of the confluence of the Ganga Jamna, right? And that's the Magadhan lands. You would think that they're quite different, and of course they are. Ashoka did not surround himself with Brahmins, he was a Buddhist. So in a way, he was pulling free of the Brahminical control in the Aryavarta lands. He had something slightly different, but it was not as different as you would think. If you look at Ashoka's Prakrit and you look at Pali and you look at Ardhamagadi, they are not too far off from Sanskrit as far as I see it. A lot of the features that you associate with that part of India had not yet come into the language at all. They look just like cousins of the Prakrits that were on the West. If you look at all of Ashoka's inscriptions and pillars, there's tiny details that are different. So this is something that mystified me until I went myself to Allahabad a week ago. And walking around in the institute where I was, I found that everybody spoke to me in Hindi or in English, right? Just like Ashokan times, a little bit of a different Allahabad accent in Hindi, but we were speaking that and English. That's like saying Sanskrit and Prakrit in a way. Elites do this. All the people helping out in the guest house were speaking in Bhojpuri. There was a gap between the kind of people who help out in the guest house and the kind of people who are the professors of physics and mathematics or literature or my friends in Allahabad. So nothing had actually changed. I still don't have the answer to how it came about like this. I'm writing about it right now. I just stopped in order to do this. And I'm looking at Ashoka and Prakrit, Pali and Ardha Magadhi, looking for features that are unique to the area. They're not there. They haven't come into the language yet. So there's something interesting. It's like saying that I'm a South Indian, I'm a Tamilian, I speak English. Ashoka is a Magadhan, he speaks Prakrit. And his Prakrit is very similar to the other Prakrits in other parts of India. It was like something that unified the elites, at least the royal caste. And Buddha, what was there about Buddha? Why was Pali, which he endorsed, so grammatically similar to Sanskrit? I mean, you can see differences. But like when I studied Pali, we did not even have classes in Pali. We were just given texts, dictionaries, grammar book, go home and translate. And it could be done. You got to know what was different.
I get your point that it's, even though we speak very different languages, but when all of Indians, when we speak English,
yes,
it sounds like Indian English, whether it's somebody in Bihar speaking or somebody in Maharashtra or me in Delhi.
That's a Prakrit.
And to outsiders, it's our, so that's our Prakrit of English. Like there was a Prakrit to Sanskrit in the past.
Exactly.
But just to break it down more, so you were saying that there was Sanskrit, which was the liturgical, the literary language.
Brahminic. It wasn't literary because it wasn't actually written. For some reason, these Vedic people were desperately allergic to writing, and I haven't completely figured out why, except one friend of mine who's a Brahmin said, well, it makes perfect sense. If everything is to be memorized, then you can't get outsiders like Peggy, Mohan coming in and reading your text and saying, oh, I know everything that you know. It can be held much more closely in
do you think they
a
could
small
write?
family.
Do you think they could write? Did they have a script?
No, they didn't use a script. They didn't have one. Something, well, Devanagari came up around the time of Panini, which was saying 500 BC. And even then it wasn't used, not for liturgical things. It was always memorized.
But the most ancient script that we have in India after the Indus Valley script would be some form of Brahmi script, which would be going back. How far does that go back in India?
But it goes back far, but the question is, what was it used for? It wasn't used for Sanskrit texts. Those were memorized. It was used for Ashoka's inscriptions, and not always. I mean, up in Afghanistan, he used other things like
okay.
Aramaic.
But other civilizations had a script that they were using for much longer, right? For example, Mesopotamia and all, they had been writing systems for much longer. And to exchange with them, India could have acquired a writing script from them, even if we had not devised one of our own. But you're saying that there was some aversion to writing. It was a culturally...
That's what I think. It was a cultural thing. It's like there are certain societies that say, our neighbors have slaves, we don't keep slaves. Our neighbors eat meat, we don't eat meat. Our neighbors write, we will memorize. And it did go badly for them. As I said, it managed to keep the whole, the gyan, the whole knowledge, the Shrauta rituals in the hands of Brahmins. And they were able to use these Vedic rituals to cement a relationship with kings. So Brahmins and kings were the distinguishing features of that early time. So when
and
you
go on. I did just one more thing. Sorry.
Go on, you go on.
No, I just want to clarify one thing. So it sounds like you're saying is the Brahmanical control was in what they sort of defined as Aryavarta, which extended in the east up to the confluence of Ganga and Jamuna. But then
depends on the time, because initially in the time of the Rig Veda, it didn't go that far. It was in the Indus Valley area. And then before the time of Manu, it went only to the confluence. After Manu, it crossed. And then you started getting the whole axis shifting into the Magadhan area.
And so in Ashokan times, did the Brahmanical have only exercise only a soft power into the Magadhan areas, or did
No.
they actually have some sort of control?
No, there were Brahmins there, small numbers, they were visitors. And it was almost like a Kalapani thing that Brahmins who actually went and settled there were not well regarded by the Vedic Brahmins on the west side of the confluence in the Aryavarta lands. So there was influence, and I'm trying to find out more about how this influence worked. It doesn't need Brahmins being there in power to push the languages across the confluence, because in India, English has done better after the British left than when they were here.
Yes, this is exactly why I was said, was it just soft power of Sanskrit that even though they had no direct control over the Magadhan lands, if they are speaking some kind of Prakrit in Magadhan land, right? So at least some people are, the Shokan Magadhan, and which is a close cousin of Sanskrit. So
Yes.
the Sanskrit is clearly exercising some kind of influence even in areas beyond the Brahmanical control.
Well, put it this way, you and I are speaking English right now, but I can't see any link to Oxford and Cambridge in what we are doing right now. We are speaking English for reasons that have to do with it suiting the kind of thing that you set up, this kind of program. It's completely unrelated to whether Britain exists or not. So similarly, if you need that kind of a relationship across the landmass, kings, emperors, they would have to have some form of language which is close enough for them to keep in contact, unless they were hostile. And for some reason, there seems to have been a détente, because all the things you read about in the later Vedic times were going on simultaneously to Ashoka conquering that area. And they didn't even look at each other, it seems. It's almost like that.
Yeah, because the interesting thing is, like, we think of Mauryan Empire as the political center of India at the time. And that center is not Brahmanical. So the political power is not there. But clearly there is some kind of soft power behind Sanskrit at this time. That
Prakrit, because there is Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit that exists, but basically it's like saying that there was Latin in Germany, there was Latin in England. That
yes,
elites tend to look for
Latin, this. But Latin had some kind of soft power that extended to lands far beyond Rome.
Right.
And even though Rome was a political center of power, but it seems like in India's case, even when the Aryavarta or the Indo-Gangetic plains or towards the west were not the lands of the Brahmanicals were not the power center. Still, they had immense cultural power from Sanskrit, emanating from Sanskrit. So this is also something I want to understand. So a lot of times people on social media would say that Sanskrit is a scientific language, it is the most sophisticated language. Admittedly, a lot of that is just cultural chauvinism.
It is.
But is there some science? Is there some truth to it? Like, can languages be superior or inferior in terms of their grammatical structure for a linguist? I just wanted to clarify that.
No, because the first modern linguists who worked in the US, they actually said, we're not going to look at Latin and Greek. We've had enough of that. We've had enough of prescriptive linguistics, telling people how they should speak to be like the elite. And they turned their attention to Native American tribes and found languages so astonishingly complex. And if we had done the same, and when we do the same, we find it in India, I'm pouring through data on languages of Jharkhand, or trying to get back to languages up in the Himalayas, which are quite far from the beaten track. And they're extremely complex in very different ways. It's hard to say. People manage to speak with just about everything. But something about Sanskrit did not fit eventually. And by the time we got to around 500 BC, all sorts of Brahmin men, not women, started mucking around with it, changing it, putting in things like you get in Hindi now, maine kaha, this ne thing started coming in. they were not happy with the amount of conjugation of verbs that was there. Could we just put past participles? You know, kaya, kaha, that kind of thing in Sanskrit, kadita. Could we do that? And
simplifying it? Was that a simplification of the language
yes,
that was done? Okay.
There was, but there's an interesting thing about a Prakrit. A Prakrit technically has to be a language which follows the rules of something like this, the standard language. That could be English, that could be Sanskrit, it could be well, other languages elsewhere in the Persian sphere of influence. For example, let's look at a good Prakrit that we both speak, Indian English. We can all say, this is with me only.
Yes.
It's not English. It is a way of avoiding a very difficult concept, which is the verb to have, which can take a subject like I. I have. You cannot say I have in just about any Indian language. You can say it is with me, and then you add only. This is a simplification, but in a particular direction. It's bringing in a mindset that is not British, which is Indian, but it has to follow rules that don't make it sound wrong in English. If I said, this is with me, it's not bad English. It sounds a little exotic. So this kind of things.
It sounds wrong to non-Indians for sure.
They can't find a grammar rule that has it.
No, it's like
wrong.
odd. It's like odd.
It's
like
odd. It's exotic. But no, that's different from Creole saying, "Afi me that." Now that is not English. That is Creole English. That does not even pretend to follow English grammar rules. Whereas, it is with me only is giving a hat tip or nod towards English grammar. So these kinds of things started happening in Sanskrit, where
various Prakrits were close enough to Sanskrit, but so they were not some sort of pidgin languages far away.
Not at all. There were no pidgins in India ever. And that's what I'm finding in my new book. Pidgins are a very different thing. Pidgins are something that people who are mostly men, yes, all men, on short-term visits away from home, pick up a trade language, and then when they go home, they abandon it again. That's why people can say that pidgins never have descendants, never have native speakers. If I have to go to Nagaland, or if I'm a Naga and I'm coming to Assam, I need to pick up something to speak. Unfortunately, Nagas were just too good at it. They didn't pick up a pidgin at all. They pretty much picked up Assamese with a few little details being different. No, it was not a pidgin. What it was is like Indian English, grammatically a little quaint, but not wrong. And that's important because there is a sense in the Prakrits of all the stakeholders having to be agreed that this is an okay thing to do. And then when it got into the Prakrits, you start seeing it slipping into Sanskrit. All the Ashokan pillars have this nay type thing, because they managed to bring it in. And
so you were saying around 500 BC, there was some kind of debate going on within the Sanskrit Brahmins in order to align themselves on the rules of Sanskrit?
No, you just gently slip it into whatever you write or compose. You pull it in. Nobody minds because everybody is like you. It's like if you and I are talking in English and the Brits don't exist, nor do the Americans, because we are in our own space. We're not asking anyone's permission. And it's just slipping in as something not wrong. And it's just spreading into more and more things that you can see in the local language, in Indian English. So these new features came up in Prakrit. And after some time, the people who were speaking Prakrit and maybe writing a little in Prakrit were the same people who were writing in Sanskrit at other times. And it's just very easy to make a crossover, and you start seeing things in Sanskrit that did not conform to how you would speak in Vedic times. So, but it did not shake the grammatical foundations. What happened much later in the 12th century, when we got things like modern Dehlavi, Marathi, Bengali, even Malayalam, way down south, those shook the foundations of Sanskrit. They did not pretend to be Sanskrit at all.
Yeah, so where do they come from? Are they just even further corrupted Prakrits?
I don't like that word at all. Corrupted does not, no. In fact, the easiest thing is to think that there's a discontinuity. At some point, new players were there. What did they have going for them? They had that thing that we don't have access to, local languages that were spoken, are still spoken. It's like saying you and I are speaking English, but all around us are Indian languages which are not entering this program. So they were speaking in Prakrit, they knew Sanskrit, the elites, but there was a lot going on in languages which were never recorded. We get a whiff of them because they all came back up around the 10th century in the new languages that were made with very different grammars.
Let me try and understand this using a more recent analogy, so it's more relatable. So let's say when Farsi came into India, it was the language, Persian, where it was a language of power, prestige, prominence, emanating immense soft power, just like Sanskrit probably did in far antiquity. And when it came to India, it was the language of the ruling elite, but the common people around them were speaking Braj or far away Bhojpuri or Avadhi or whatever, or other languages. And in the interaction, obviously some kind of Prakrits to Persian would have first emerged.
Not at all. It was more complicated than that. The people who came in as the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughals, they did not come in from Iran. Just let's get that out of the way. Yes, Persian had soft power, immense soft power all over Central Asia. But these people were from Uzbekistan. In fact, a particular part of Uzbekistan, not even all of it. So Uzbeks came speaking Persian the way Indian techies go to Silicon Valley speaking English. They have the other thing where they say nana, nani. And similarly, we have a few Uzbek words for appa and khala, and these are just about the only ones that are left. So they came in speaking Persian because educated people knew Persian, just as we go to the US speaking English. And we may complain that our languages are vanishing, but we're not doing much to protect them because they don't have that kind of value. So what happened is when the Uzbeks came to India, they discovered that the language that they didn't have much respect for, Uzbek, could be replaced because there were Indian languages doing essentially the same things for your daily life, for your early years as a child. So they switched to these languages. And the one that eventually in the 1700s got to be called Urdu was basically then called only Dehlavi. And I have an objection to making a distinction between Hindi, Hindustani, and all of that, because in those days, this Dehlavi thing was called Hindi half the time. And Urdu was always just called Hindi. It's only when the Sanskritized Hindi decided that, no, this will only refer to us. And it was actually a latecomer on the scene. It's not the real Hindi. The real Hindi was 12th century, and it was spoken in Delhi. It was not even a compromise of anything. So you had Farsi coming in, Uzbek Farsi, just like Indian English, Uzbek Farsi. And you had this Dehlavi dialect, which is what we know now.
Urdu to you is not a Prakrit. It is a language that
Urdu is Dehlavi. It is not any different from Hindi.
It was already the local language that just absorbed some Persian vocabulary.
And not all at once. Remember that when the Delhi Sultanate came in here, and that was exactly that wonderful time, the 12th century, 13th century, they came in and found this language already in existence, Dehlavi. You might find that here and there they said, let's use the word Darya instead of Nadi. They have all the heavens. This is as Indian as you get. It was there, they did nothing to take it out. They had exactly the same genders in Urdu and Hindi as in Sanskrit. Well, no, it was simplified a little, but there's not too much difference. So basically, Urdu goes back to Dehlevi, which predates by a few years the arrival of the Delhi Sultanate and later on the Mughals. So they just saw it and said, right, we'll take this. And
okay. So now going back to Sanskrit, you mentioned there were already lots of local languages that we know very little about. Is it possible that the languages that we speak today as Punjabi or Malayalam, these are just those languages which then absorbed a lot of Sanskrit vocabulary?
Not Sanskrit, Prakrit. Malayalam is different. It took Sanskrit, but the whole north took Prakrit vocabulary. In fact, right now I'm looking at all the things in Punjabi, which if you stripped away the Prakrit vocabulary, you might get something looking a lot like a South Indian language. Yeah, Kabbo, Sabjo, Kabbo, the phonetics of it, the kind of, well, I worked back trying to separate out what was gender, what kind of gender would there have been in the language before Sanskrit came. Gender came via the Prakrits, but what could it have been? What kind of a language would not mind taking gender? And the answer is a Dravidian language, because they have gender in the sense of he, she, and it. So could Punjabi at one time have been a language with he, she, and it? To this day, proper Punjabi can't do bha, dha, cha. It's pa, ta, cha. These is all very Dravidian reluctance to engage with certain alien Sanskrit sounds. You have Pani, Jana, all of these are Dravidian Sandhi rules. So the question is that what would Punjabi look like? It'd be fun to strip it and speak it with Tamil words and see that it's closer probably to Tamil than Hindi is.
That's one of the most shocking things I've heard, because
it's lovely. It's wonderful, because I have a son-in-law whose family on his mother and father's side come from Harappa. Now, isn't that awesome? A Punjabi, totally Punjabi from Harappa. What else is Harappa if not Punjab? Punjabi, yes, about 100 years back had all the rla that you get in Marathi and South Indian languages. It's dying out now. So it's like the heart of the whole Harappan culture, and you can feel it still in the modern language. I'm so excited. I don't want to feel that it should have been painted over with Sanskrit or Prakrits. It had to happen. Prakrits came into Punjabi in exactly the way that English is coming into all the cooking videos in Malayalam, Bengali, Gujarati, that somebody like me will watch and find, I can follow this thing.
Doesn't this challenge the conventional classification of Indian languages, North
Yes,
Indian, Indo-European,
absolutely.
South Indian as Dravidian?
Yes,
and then
it does.
So that's quite that's a big deal. I mean,
yes,
because
you find this with.
Right. I mean, people have been saying we are different people. They come from the Indo-Europeans. We are from Dravidians. People have turned the linguistic groups into ethnic groups and all sorts of.
I don't buy that, because basically, if you have a two-stranded genetic history of local women and some, not all, some of the men coming in as migrants, then we have been discounting all along a much older strand in our modern languages. Hindi is a little off the highway between that. Punjabi goes straight down the western coast to the south. Hindi is somewhere towards the Magadhan zone, so it's got some influences. It doesn't do a number of the things that Punjabi does. It doesn't have la, it doesn't have as much la. It is happy with bha. I haven't figured that one out. But I believe that I'm not comfortable saying Indo-Aryan, because it comes from a time when we believe that human beings and languages were like trees. You just had one, the seed grew, and it came out exactly like the male line. Whatever line had the vocabulary was the descent line. Now that's a patrilineal system. But if you have languages which have so many other features, and you can go all the way to Pashto and see some of what I'm telling you about Punjabi has been preserved in Pashto, way up in the Northwest. It's just mind-blowing. A gender system, like the notion that gender is only for verbs, not for adjectives. That's like South India. In Punjab, it's both. It'll be
So
both.
I take it you don't buy the
Huh?
theory. So I take it you don't buy the theory that Sanskrit is the mother of all Indian languages, or at least all North Indian.
Firstly, there's a gender problem. The men who came in, the Vedic men were not women. So I don't think they could have been mothers of anything. They could have been fathers. I normally use a different metaphor. I say Sanskrit is the great uncle, because it turned into a finished product. And after the time of Panini, it was not meant to change much. And it didn't change much.
He formalized it.
It was,
he formalized
yeah.
rules.
So it did not enter into the kind of interchange that was making up modern languages, except in Kerala. Kerala, because Sanskrit words came through literature, then they were entered into their epics by Brahmins who were writing, and they came into proper Malayalam. You'll notice that
hold off on that. I do want to ask about Sanskrit's influence of all the other Indian languages. But one thing is well known, that Sanskrit did influence Tamil, Malayalam, and all the languages it came into contact with. What I want to ask you is, was Sanskrit influenced itself by any of the other languages that it came into contact with when in India?
One thing is very clear, that Sanskrit picked up and it did not pick up la, but the Prakrits had it. The first word of the Rig Veda has it, which tells me that that copy of Sushruta's Samhita was retrieved in the south, where it says Om Agni Mirle Purohitam. The la is a reflex of a da, which is something that's done in Kerala and Tamil Nadu. So the very first compound word of the Rig Veda has a Dravidian influence. But more important than that is all the other are not found anywhere except in India and two other places, which are also from the first migration out of Africa: Australian Aboriginal languages and the languages of Central New Guinea. So once you start hearing da, na, and la, and sh is also there, and to some extent in the Indus Valley, not in the south, you know that you're talking about something very old, very Indian as our mDNA.
But how do we know that Sanskrit borrowed this from other languages, or it was core to Sanskrit, since it was also originated here along with the Dravidian language?
If it did, but the question is that Sanskrit behaves in a very different way from all the other Indian languages in terms of having cases, having declensions and conjugations of the verb, which are not typical. Here you will get instead in India something more Dravidian, and even the tribal languages of the East have it. You would say ghar mein, and I'm looking at a lot of data these days from Jharkhand. It's all there. It's all there in the south. Sanskrit didn't do this. Sanskrit had case endings. Sanskrit behaved in some ways like languages similar to Latin and Greek, and Avestan, which was in Iran. So
your point is, while Sanskrit is an Indo-European language, the other Indian languages just seem like them. They have
picked
some
up words,
but they are core Indian languages, not dissimilar from Tamil, Malayalam, and other Indian languages.
Not too dissimilar. Of course, there have been things like Punjabi has grammatical gender that came from the Prakrits, which came from Sanskrit. Marathi has grammatical gender. It's not just he, she, and it. It's something more. Chairs, tables, cars all have gender in these languages. This has come from Prakrits and ultimately from Sanskrit. The idea that you can break up things in this way, classify nouns in this way. We had other classification systems which are still in use in the East, But so there's been a kind of a fusion. But when I look at all the languages of India, the only one that stands out as a guest who came to visit is Sanskrit and stayed.
Okay.
I think English did that too, and so did Persian. So these are our elite languages.
Which came with some sort of like power behind them when they came. Because I mean, lots of languages keep coming via merchants and traders and all. But these languages came with a kind of political dominance.
That's an important point. Yeah.
At some point.
That's an important point, because India was always a place that migrants came to. So there may have been people trickling in ones and twos, small families. We never hear about them. Those kind of migrants kind of vanish. They assimilate and they get along. They learn the local language. It's what we are seeing when you talk of Indo-European or Central Asian or Dravidian are large groups that came to political power. So that's what made them different, and they spread.
Because I would imagine like Farsi probably came along before the Delhi Sultanate with the Parsis to India. It must have come with the Parsis.
Came later. Parsis came, but they didn't see. Parsi would not have been spreading. They have Zen.
They had no power behind them.
Yeah,
they were just refugees.
Right,
so
exactly. Small minority and no political or military power. So when you say that the Indo-Europeans and the Vedic people were kind, gentle, sweet people, and we should love them, any group that can enter India and spread its words over 3/4 of this landmass is not a sweet little bunch of people. They're powerful. They had political power.
So they brought, obviously the Sanskrit got the prominence that it got, and these, but it sounds like from what you're telling me, the Prakrits probably influenced the Indian languages even more than Sanskrit directly. Then that
so
to me,
yeah.
When we think about the story of Indian languages, nobody really talks about Prakrit other than in the context of Ashokan edicts or the Buddhist texts. You know, like I feel like if they were so important, how come there is not much research, discussion around these Prakrits?
Oh, you would be shocked at how much misinformation there is. I'm right now, well, on a different part of India, looking at the Magadhan area, how people have simply accepted that, oh, you know, all our ekta, duta, ekjon, dujon in Bengali, that goes back to Indo-Aryan. Hello? It's not in Sanskrit. It's not in any of the Prakrits. I'm pulling out the Prakrits. But they're very content that some powerful guy in a nicely bound textbook long back said, oh, Grierson failed to find them in the Linguistic Survey of India. So he said, okay, they weren't there. Depends on how you elicit your data. So basically, a lot of people are quite, I think, mousy. A good academic says, yes, if that's what the field says, I agree. And you look at what Hindi teachers teach in class about what are the cases. They talk of cases. I walked into a Hindi class once and I saw a teacher saying, Maine khana khaya. Maine is the first karak. It's not, it's the third. But he doesn't know it, and he's not supposed to because nobody talks about it. A few linguists talk about it. And even the linguists don't delve as deeply as it. I basically find that when I see a problem in a hiccup, an inflection point in Indian history where I don't know what happened, I can't let it go. I'm trying like anything to find out. I'm asking everyone, asking people who've walked around in the tribal areas in Jharkhand, do you hear this thing? I look in Ashokan pillars, I look to see if I'm right, but many people just let it go. Okay, here's what you teach for Hindi. It has cases, it has Tatpurush, it has Dvigu, because I think people are obedient. And a little bit of disobedience is how you get past these problems.
And I don't know, maybe also disinterested, because every nation creates its own myth, right? So we've created a myth where our foundation of our culture, civilization is in Sanskrit, which is okay. But then it seems like the evidence is that there is tons that, which we call Indian culture, which predates Sanskrit.
Yes.
And there is a lot more strains that make up Indian culture. It's not all originating from Sanskrit, as is taught, at least in popular culture, to us. But Prakrits were not just colloquial languages. They went on to become literary languages as well.
They were essentially literary. They were elite. You will find that, for example, women only spoke in Prakrit, but when you look at what they say, you pretty much can understand them from Sanskrit. It's just like, it's, you know, my best example is once I met an old woman in Kerala, and she was reciting things from the Rig Veda. And she sounded like Shakuntala in Kalidasa, with all the Dravidian sandhis added into the pronunciation. And I said, this is Shakuntala. This is Prakrit. The initial Prakrits are basically all not too far from Sanskrit spoken with a Dravidian accent. Or now you can get Sanskrit spoken with a Bengali accent, also takes a little bit of getting used to. One would call them Prakrits in ancient times. So, except that they're now written, and everything is written, so you don't see in your face the differences between how people pronounce things.
But there is all this literature in Prakrits, like the Maharashtri Prakrits, the Saurasheni, from which Hindi and all came. So are people researching all that literature, because that would embody a large part of Indian history, right?
Yes. People
and why don't we call those like consider them among our classical languages if there is so much of old literature? Imagine another country, France, had like so much literature, 1,000-year-old literature in our language. Wouldn't that be considered among the classical literature of France and almost revered? How come it's all ignored and just Sanskrit is prioritized and everything else is kind of like put aside?
It fits a narrative, and the narrative being, and it goes back to colonial times, that see, the Brits were wrong. We actually like them. We are Aryans, and therefore we want to forefront the thing that made us feel good, not in the abstract, that we're good because we are whoever we are, but see, compared with the Brits, we have an older culture, and it's also in the same Aryan sphere. I don't like that, partly because I think that the most exciting things in India probably happened before that, and we've lost them. And we can retrieve a certain amount of stuff, but we know that genetics is coming in a big way, and finding a lot of the things that we say, what I say in linguistics, is matching their stuff. Like if I say that every language of India except Assamese and the Northeast, or of South Asia, except Assamese and the tribal languages in the Northeast, has retroflexion, d, t, d, d, or t, d, at least, may not have d. I may say that they have all of this, but I forgot where I'm going with that. You're going to have these kind of senior moments with me. Yeah.
So you mentioned this in your book as well, right? The retroflexion is almost the DNA.
Yes, that's right. That's what I was going to say.
South Asia or Indian subcontinent.
Yes.
And obviously we can't expect it in Assamese, which came much later with the...
No, not necessarily. Assamese would have a lot of shared DNA with us, but they're on the fringe. And anyone who's on the fringe could, for very different reasons, unlinked to DNA, change. After all, you and I are speaking English, and neither one of us is British. So Assamese, way up in the far Northeast.
So it's interesting to me that the retroflexion is what makes Indian English Indian to outsiders, because we say things like ada or da, or like our consonants are so strong, like the D's are so strong as they're not usually among.
Put. Yeah. Almost a click.
Put. And it's almost like a little bit hard for outsiders to hear these strong consonants. But a lot of Indians are able to drop them. For example, like a lot of Indians, I guess from urban centers, when we are outside, we bring all the retroflection when we are speaking our own language. When I speak in Hindi, I get all the retroflection back, but I'm able to drop most of it when I'm speaking in English.
Now, that is the definition of an Anglo-Indian. An Anglo-Indian speaks without retroflection in English, which is different from other Indians. But the minute they get into Indian words, they get it back. And I remember somebody was doing a study at Jindal University at what caused the biggest problem for, say, in telemarketing for Chinese and Japanese to understand English. And this was retroflection. And they said, if it weren't for retroflection, the Indian accent is best for international use in English. It's better than British because you can't follow what the Brits are saying. It's such a strong accent. You can't follow Americans. But Indian English, with, as I said, without mother tongue influence, by which they mean retroflection. They're probably not familiar with the word. But yeah, so retroflection is the thing that is there in...
I think you gave it a beautiful example in your book, like, and I've tried this with some of my non-Indian friends. So dant and dant. Now I immediately hear two words, tut and scolding.
Yeah.
But outsiders, they don't hear it. Just to them, it just sounds like I'm speaking with more of an Indian accent.
No, I tell you what, it's a little more than that. My professor who also guided one of my two thesis guides, not my Sanskrit professor, he knows Hindi and Marathi very well. He's American. But he says, he confesses, I can pronounce any of these sounds, but I don't hear them so readily. And it's true of me too, because I grew up in the West Indies where retroflection was lost from our language. And I studied it and I found I still at times do a Google search to make sure that it's a t or a t, because
you don't have it naturally.
No, and Indians also do, have a lot of other cues. You have a whole dictionary in your head. You know these words from before. You also know what it's likely to be. You may mishear at times, but less likely. Most of comprehension is about prediction. Context. And about knowing a huge amount more data than, say, I would know. You know more. You will always know more words in Indian languages than I will. So
also, like, I think Indians do drop it if they live for a long time outside. Like, for example, the gypsies who originated in India have dropped, like, they've dropped now.
They must have. Because all in,
like,
not
1,000 years.
That's 1,000 years. All the Jahajis who went abroad as migrant labor all lost it.
Right. So, and that's not even that old. That's probably just
150 years.
Yeah, 150 years. Whereas the Roma people and others have been away for like 1,000 years. Yeah. So, is it so? When I'm just trying to imagine, so there were some kind of Brahmanical people in the northern part who were speaking Sanskrit. And when they were interacting with their other neighbors who were speaking the local language, so with them, they could speak the local language and they would bring in the retroflection, I guess, at some point, learn the retroflection.
Not quite like that. It doesn't happen like that. Nobody changes in their lifetime. What happens is that you marry a local woman and your children grow up first learning her language. And then they pick up their father's Sanskrit and start contributing to the Rig Veda, making verses, but you are already a bilingual because you know your mother's language. So the men who came, they themselves did not change. They may have been writing and doing brilliant. In fact, my Sanskrit professor is very certain that the first verses written in the Rig Veda did not have ta, tha, da, dha, and sh. No.
What grounds? What makes him certain that they would not have had these?
A few things. The way they were brought in, they always were brought in with some contextual reason for why it should be here, rather than it's here because it's here. We had a few words like the goddess Usha with a sh. You notice this different from the shas in Asha. So Usha, Kavasha, who wrote some of the verses in the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda. These, or the words like Mani, where For no reason on earth, no explanation. These sounds are there, but they always had to justify them. They tried to justify them, but actually, no, it's there because there's a ra in the word or there's a li in the word. That's one. The other thing nobody ever told me, but I decided, I suddenly looked at a page of the Rig Veda and said, hello, there's not much retroflexion here in quantity. The quantity is way lower than it should be for an Indian language. The sounds are there, but you don't get them often. So these are the things. And the other thing is that we know historically that the Rig Veda just sort of subsided into the different families, the Shakhas, and 700 years later, they were collected. What happens in 700 years? When you have all sorts of your dumb kids and not understanding what they're reciting, and they're speaking Prakrit, which has a lot of retroflexion. So it finds its way in, and by the time that it's actually collected and all the linguists have gone, they're gone with their present notion of what the language is like. And they said, they had a lot of arguments. What did you hear? No, I heard a t. The other one, no, I definitely heard a t. That kind of thing was going on. And in the end, they decided, and here and there, they said, look, this is not going to make sense if we say it is a t. Let's say it's a t. So these things were happening at that time. So we know about that too. So
the languages are always evolving. I mean, so it's not surprising at all. But so going back, you said Prakrits were also elite languages. So it's interesting because in Shakuntala, the example you gave, Kalidas puts the male character speaking in Sanskrit, but the females who were in a patriarchal society inferior are speaking in Prakrit. So they are not allowed to learn Sanskrit. So there is a hierarchy there already. And the servants are also speaking.
Yeah, not only with Kalidas, even in Brahminical families to this day. I have friends who come from South Indian Brahmin families or Maharashtrian Brahmin families who wanted to earn a living as Sanskrit teachers because they know it. They've heard it all their lives. And they said they had to overcome block because they were taught as kids, women don't speak this. So it's there even. It's common enough in India. There are many things like in Haryanvi families, women don't speak Persian or write Urdu, but men do. So there's this kind of, we've always had this in India.
But so there's several levels. So there's elite men, then there are women and their servants who are at lower levels speaking Prakrit. And then there is the common people who are speaking the local languages. So
right. What are those? That is a wonderful question. I'm sure that they would have been speaking something much more similar to the old, at least in the Northwest, the old Indus Valley languages. They can't have died straight away. They would have taken a while to die.
Okay. And so there is a quote which is often mentioned in text. So by Mirza Khan, who wrote Tofat al-Hind in 1676. So when he describes and he characterizes Prakrit as the language of the lowest of the low, stating that the language was known as Patal Bani or Nag Bani, as in like Nag, as in like putting it right to the bottom.
It wouldn't matter.
That was a misunderstanding at the time based on...
But was it Prakrit? Were you sure it was Prakrit?
No, I mean, that's what he characterizes Prakrit as a very... But he might actually be using Prakrit as a term for the local languages.
Yes. Well, that's the same way as Amir Khusro used the word Hindavi to mean Gujarati, Punjabi, Braj, Bhojpuri. Anything that was not Persian and was from Hind was Hindavi. So people are not very careful with these things. And by the 16th century, we were already getting into what you asked me about earlier, the Upper Brahmshas, which is kind of the little missing links here and there, languages which are beginning to look modern.
Before you go to Upper Brahmshas, actually, I want to have one more question on Prakrit. So there is one very mysterious Prakrit, if it's that, which has always intrigued me. It's Peshachi. So apparently it's the language, it's a literary language in which India's third great epic was written, Brihat Katha, rather than Mahabharata, Ramayana, the Brihat Katha. But it's a language where the original text is lost. it's only mentioned in other places, and it's mentioned that it was written in Peshachi. And there is so much of academic debate, it seems, around the language remains extremely shrouded in mystery. There are people who believe Kashmiri actually comes from Peshachi. And then there is also all sorts of people that why was it called Peshachi? There is one view where it is considered that the language was probably extinct at the time when it was first mentioned. Or it was, another view is that the language of Peshachi is probably mentioning a language of tribal people who were, and Peshach, calling them Peshach might be just a pejorative way of calling people Rakshas and whatnot. And then there is other kinds of things that there is another view that it might have been a cryptic language which was never actually spoken. It was only used for literary purposes, which is quite kind of fascinating. I just want to know if in your research you came across this language.
I haven't worked on this, but I would say that people have a strong tendency to say such and such a language came from this Prakrit. That's not so simple. These languages have a lot more local flavor. Even Kashmiri has a number of things which mark it as separate from the rest of South Asia. Word order, things like that. Or they say that Assamese came up from Kamarupi Prakrit, but not really. What came is words. So these Prakrits donated words, but these words were put onto frames which were older. But yeah. So Assamese will have the words from Kamarupi Prakrit, but it has a very different notion on, it has a very Magadhan structure, which was not in any of the Prakrits at all. That's something that is just, my students pointed this out to me, which I took for granted. Of course not. Prakrits are different, but Magadhans. One of my students said, how could an area so far east be so similar to the West? And I started thinking about it. So there is a huge disconnect, and I call it the great disconnect. And when the Prakrit languages gave their words, but the operating system, the grammatical structure is something older and from the languages of the area. Sometimes they're tribal languages.
It's a nice theory. It's a nice theory, because I feel like if there was some kind of dominance, it's like a re-emergence of the underdog, you know.
Yeah,
it makes for a very nice story, and I see myself as a descendant of more of that underdog than
I know. I was
a story I like.
Somebody I know has done some work on Indus Valley script, and she's basically saying, well, to cut short, that a lot of the seals are really hallmarks. The markings on it are not language, they're hallmarks, and they're jewelers' things. And I come from that sort of a background. My family are traditional Indian goldsmiths and silversmiths. And I felt, wow, do you mean that people like my ancestors, though not necessarily in the same place, might have been linked to an older culture in India, where goldsmithing was part of making currency, minting, and it involved a lot of important things for the economy and trade. And therefore, what's so exciting about that in my past is nothing to do with Sanskrit. It goes straight back to earlier times than that.
Right, absolutely. And you mentioned that in later texts of Rig Veda, we see like Rig Veda has retroflexion, but not as much as we normally use right now in our languages. Yeah. But do you see an growth in retroflexion in further Vedas, like as later Vedic texts arise?
I haven't checked that. I haven't. I imagine there would be, I can't say. But I know that there's more retroflexion as you head south. But that compared with the northeast, the northwest has. So like in terms of quantum of retroflexion, maximum is the south of India and Maharashtra somewhat in between. Gujarat and Rajasthan are kind of transitory. Punjab at one time would have been pretty much on the same highway. Sindh has some other things. But when you get into the Hindi zone and further east, you get less of it, and which is strange. I don't understand it, because these are the people who were the original migrants into India who brought retroflexion. So clearly the Dravidians liked it, and they picked it up and they ran with it and did more. While in the Munda tribes, the Jharkhand tribes, you begin to see it declining a little bit, a little bit. So all these are things I don't fully understand, because can you imagine what all sorts of twists and turns history has taken that we don't even know about?
Where we are, yes, of course. And do you have a theory around on why Sanskrit fell out of use at some point, as well as the Prakrits, why they stopped and these new languages emerged? What might have happened?
It's all ecological. Who are the people who matter? If you have town culture coming up, technology coming up, crafts coming up, you have an economy developing, which is not based on kings, you're going to find that that will dictate how languages work. What happened is, instead of having elites speaking Prakrit across the landmass and little people not knowing much about each other, you suddenly got local languages on large regional areas, but picking up the Prakrit words. So you're getting much more fusion within regions than across India. We're at another inflection point in India now with Indian English, where it's like those days before the local languages asserted themselves, where you have much more possibility of speaking to someone from Bengal, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, or Maharashtra, who is elite, than they have of speaking to their own common people about important things. So something we are right now, it's good to see the parallels, because you can understand what it must have been like just before the 10th, 11th, 12th century struck. We're there again. Indian history seems to be so circular that whatever's happened has happened before. So
yeah,
we are at that
Professor
point.
Richard even talks about like a Sanskrit cosmopolis, not only in India, but spreading across Asia, where the elites could all had a common form of communication in Sanskrit. How did Sanskrit percolate into the southern languages, since the Brahmanical people presumably did not expand all the way down south?
Some did, some did. Some went down, and Tamil has not so much. They also have a tradition of taking tadbhavas from the Prakrits. So they have both. The words coming via Prakrit and words coming via Sanskrit. The people moved. They met each other, and you have to have these kinds of things happening. Malayalam was, of course, different, because they had a specific group of Brahmins who had come from somewhere else and were maintaining Sanskrit. And it came through literature. So the thing about Sanskrit and any high language is that it's very useful for the more abstruse, academic, philosophical, whatever things. And so whenever you say that you're going to talk about literary things, and you say, but I'm going to write in Malayalam, you don't have a word for this thing in Malayalam. And so you pull it out of Sanskrit. It didn't only happen at that time. It happened again in Hyderabad in the 1700s, around Aurangzeb's time, where you were finding that poets said, we're not writing in Persian. We're writing for the common people, and we're writing political stuff. And they started writing in what they called Hindi. These are not Dakhini people. These are people who've come from the north. They were writing in Hindi, but Persian words have to keep coming in, because up till then, they didn't have the words, and they had only written these kinds of things in Persian. So the words come in, and then of course you get,
If you ask me right now to talk about something and that requires me to say words like anthropology, I will be like, I have to use these words in English. I can't actually speak in Hindi on these words. So there are certain concepts, certain words that I'm only familiar with them in English. It's totally understandable. So your point is that's how it gradually must have percolated into the South Indian languages. So
Sanskrit, and usually nouns, and almost only nouns.
Okay, that's interesting. Not the
And
verb.
similarly with Urdu, almost only nouns came from Persian. So that is a very light touch, I would say, as a linguist. You don't get verbs coming. I mean, you will find one or two in Malayalam that came from Sanskrit, but not many. It's mostly nouns. And that is an Indian thing. That is something that goes back to pre-Sanskrit days. Sanskrit had no dislike of verbs, but Indians always have. Indians would prefer to say, because of the advent of Diwali, we are cleaning the house also, because Diwali is coming. A friend of mine sent me a book that she'd written, and I just for fun said, can I edit it for you? And I take out all the Indian English if you want it published abroad. And what was in Indian English? And not, this is with me only. No, that's too obvious. Everything that could be expressed as a noun was. You know, she needed a man for
We use passive.
self-affirmation. Passive is there, but this is something that people don't notice, nouns. So Indians love nouns. And I'm talking about Indians from the south, from the north, from everywhere. And
Give me an example where we could have used a verb, but we use a noun.
yes, yeah. Like a sentence, she said that she needed a man for affirmation and definition. Or something. She needed a man to protect for protection and definition. I don't know. To protect and define her. So
right.
It's not strange at all. It's very Indian, but all these nouns all over the place. And you don't say, I like that. This is pasand hai. It's pasand. And pasand is a noun, by the way.
Even in Hindi, for example, there is no way to use to protect as a verb, because I would say Raksha is the noun, but Raksha is also the verb, I guess. There is no. Yeah, but so I would have to ask.
Rakna, you could have Rakna, but it doesn't mean the same thing. You know what they call this? This is not only India. I think Iran has it also. It's called light verbs, that you have a noun with an all-purpose verb.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Just add it to make it into a verb. They're not precisely structured as verbs.
Whereas in Spanish, you have so many verbs. You can't say that you can't land on the moon because land is earth. So you have to moon on the moon. So you have a verb, alunisar, to land on the moon. And we would never have a problem with that in India, because we just would, or even when we take English words into Hindi, something karna.
Yeah.
We take nouns.
Yeah. Exactly, we use the nouns. That's actually fascinating.
These are the kind of things that I'm looking at.
What we did with Persian, as is obvious in Urdu, but that's also what we did with Sanskrit, probably in other languages.
In Malayalam, yes.
We took all the nouns and used our own verb structures. Okay, this is really interesting. So let's just come to the present very quickly, because we've been talking for a while. I want to address a little bit of the present. When I thought about this session, I was like, let's talk about the past, which is fascinating and the most mysterious, then touch upon the present, and then one quick note on where are we going, the future. Okay. So within there's obviously right now we are in a stage where there are all these fights going on about, there are a lot of people in India who feel that we do need a language which should be the face of our nation, a unified language, a link language, they like to call it. And for nationalistic reasons, they don't think with India such a rich linguistic history, why should English serve that purpose? And as it is, English cannot ever define the Indian identity. It will always be identified with UK, US, and Anglo-Saxon countries. So there are some merits to that argument. But I just want to get your view, as a linguist, do you think consolidation of smaller languages into larger languages is a natural process which has to happen as we go from tiny kingdoms into larger nations?
See, you're putting it the wrong way. We don't do anything. Whatever we try to do, we may be so dead wrong that it will mess up. If things happen, if they're needed, and they happen very quickly within a generation. If you suddenly scrambled everybody in India and people had to talk, the chaos would not last more than 15 years. So the fact that it has lasted means it's not chaos. Something is working in its own way. However, I do agree that at least in the education system, definitely the primary schools, it's wrong to be pushing children into English because far too many Indian children are left out by this, and they're made to feel inferior for their whole lives. And they sit in the classes, and I've seen what they look like. They're yawning, they're falling asleep. It's a mental strain. So one needs to do, at least in the short run, local languages, and there's no harm in it. All teachers do it, we not say it. But when a kid doesn't know what you're saying, you simply switch to the local language, at least with children. Now, what would be the languages in India? First of all, remember what India is. India is an elitist country. It's a country that liked Persian and liked Sanskrit. Now it likes English. That has not changed. So we have never been unhappy with the elites speaking differently from the poor. It has happened maybe even in the Indus Valley times, I don't know, but definitely from Sanskrit times. So that has to not be there for the ecology to push for a single language. Now, why do we want a single language? It can't be because other countries have them. That's not a good reason. We should have a much more Indian reason than that. In the case of Indonesia, they felt they wanted to get rid of their colonial language, which was Dutch. They had one advantage over us. They were conquered by the Japanese. And the Japanese said, get rid of Dutch, learn Japanese or have a local language. And there was a local language, which was Malay. It was not Indonesian. So now, why I'm saying this is it's the opposite of a language like Tamil, where they're so proud that it's old and it's ornate and it's polite and it's complicated and all of that. That's not what you want. You want the opposite. So if India actually went through something like it went through in the 10th and 12th centuries to get common people involved in, well,
there would still be some kind of social engineering, but that would be still some kind of social engineering, right?
No, it would happen on its own. When you do social engineering, we always goof it up because we don't know what works. If people
do you think it would help with social cohesion more? Like some countries have unified the language, like Italy and others, or Spain. In some cases,
Spain has not. Spain has Catalan as a big burning issue. It doesn't like it.
I know. So as I'm saying, not successfully, brutally, with force, and not even accomplished entirely. But do you think it was needed, or did it help in any way in national unity?
These are small countries. Spain, Italy, compared with 1.4 billion Indians. China did it, and probably quite aggressively, pushing Mandarin Chinese.
Immense human expense,
yeah,
probably.
But they had an advantage over us. Their writing system was not phonetic. So you can read the same Chinese not only in other dialects of China or languages, you can read it in Japanese, you can read it in Korean. So they had that. We made so much of our scripts being phonetic that we emphasize the biggest differences between us. If I could read Malayalam without having to learn Malayalam script, I would probably not be so uncomfortable sitting in a lecture in Malayalam. I would have picked up much more because I wouldn't be going through a complicated script. So that is one thing, that we chose to keep our languages separate in terms of scripts. That's one.
But I think India is like a multilingual country anyway, right? We do speak a language at home, a language with friends, a language for work. So it's not so problematic for each region to retain their own language and then have a linked language for the country. Right now, English is serving that purpose for the elite. And English would
Not only
probably...
the elite. You see, this is the problem. The poor have understood what the elite have been up to, and English gets you jobs. So they're going to shove their kids into English medium schools. And pretty soon we're going to be like South Africa and Philippines, where we can crack jokes in the local language, but anything of any substance we'll do in English, if that's how it is to go. If you wanted an Indian linked language, I can tell you two, which would be brilliant.
Okay.
One is Dakhini. Dakhini is like Urdu with all the North Indian kinks thrown out of it. It works very well if you think in Telugu and speak in Dakhini. The other one is Nagamese. It's a
like a
simpler version. No, it's not constructed. It's just a leveled down Assamese, which to my shock, I can follow. You know, like
That's such a small percentage of people. It's probably got a very little chance of being accepted widely, no?
No, but the point is that supposing, no, you're talking about
it's easy to learn. You mean it's easy?
It's easy. Everybody from Allahabad down through Bangladesh could pick up Nagamese like that. But under Dakhini, most of India would find it very easy if we needed it. But I'm not convinced that we need it, because far too many things have gone in their own direction in India, which are hostile to these solutions.
But when I see this Hindi-Dravidian divide or the conflict, it usually rests upon the fact that, well, a lot of people in the South would say that we don't have a history of Hindi, and this is an imposition. These are all low regional languages. Why impose one regional language on the other regions? And I completely agree with them. But can Sanskrit be the solution, since it has history in every part and there is a lot of admiration and respect? And let me make a case, and it would be equally painful for everybody to learn Sanskrit. But can that
but you wouldn't be able to talk? Look, if Brahmins 500 BC were mucking around with Sanskrit because they found it horrific to deal with all those verbs and nouns, what would ordinary people who didn't want it in the first place, how would they feel? So Sanskrit sounds like a great idea until you actually approach it. Everybody who suggested Sanskrit has been somebody who doesn't know it, doesn't speak it.
But there is a precedence, right? Like Israel was able to revive a dead language
because of
dead. Cultural importance.
No, there's a difference in Israel. Pretty much every young boy learns a certain amount of Hebrew, scroll Hebrew, old ancient Hebrew. That's one. The second is they were trying to set up a new country and make a distinction between themselves and the outside world. What are we trying to do? This is not the time for that.
But we started our country saying that in 15 years, we'll replace English as the official language with Hindi, which was probably not the most wise thing. But if we have to plan something, I'm not saying make the current generation learn a linked language, but if we implement a policy at the basic education level that people learn their local language plus this linked language in schools, it would be done.
What is it? First of all, there's no such thing as a manufactured linked language. Remember, the Hindi that came up in the Delhi Sultanate times had already been born naturally and was a real language. It existed before they came. So normally when languages solve problems like this, they resort to existing languages because we know far too little about how to make a language. And just like we don't know how to construct a human being from cells, we don't know how to construct a language. And you might construct something that's so unliving and it will be rejected. Shuddh Hindi was rejected, and not just in the South.
But do you think, I sometimes think like there is like similarities to like when the East India Company was rising in India, Indian kingdoms couldn't stop fighting with each other. The Marathas were more interested in getting rid of Tipu Sultan and blah, blah, blah. And eventually they all became slaves. So then did not, because of their own conflicts, is it a little bit like the same thing with languages? Like while we're still arguing over which Indian language to unify under, English continues to conquer more and more spheres of our life.
That's happening. So the point is that you've grasped that it's not about language. It's a huge political, cultural, social, economic why do you think that parents are pushing their kids into English medium schools? They don't want their kids to have bad jobs when they grow up. And if for some reason we've decided that English is what defines your right to a particular job, because it's, then you don't have to say, I'm so-and-so's son or so-and-so's granddaughter.
Yeah, I speak flawless English, and that just makes me appear an elite or highly qualified.
So parents are going to keep pushing their kids away from their local languages. And it's had a terrible effect, because the result is that you have a bunch of kids who can't read English books, and they don't understand reading is something you do for pleasure, but they don't have their own books in their own language. They don't read. And as adults, some of them sit and think, what should I do? What should I read?
No, but I think what you're saying, I'm not unfamiliar with it. Like, I do recall days of my own early schooling where, because the medium of instruction was English and that did not come naturally, we just like sit there and listen. And I dreaded probably if asked to speak up in the class, because then you would have to make sure that you speak right English.
Right.
And it was so daunting. And when I look at like children, for example, in UK or US, little children, like they're barely like 4 years old and they talk to you like almost like adults, like perfect communication. We weren't like that. We were so shy and so reticent, especially among strangers, because it was the expectation was you'd have to speak in English.
Yeah. I had that as a child too in the Caribbean. It's all very familiar. Yeah.
But then I also want to, and then what I do see, which to me seems sad, is that a lot of parents then start talking at home in English so that the child does not have that dissonance. The child only hears English, and then the native tongue is totally lost.
Yes.
Which is, but then my question is my feeling bad about it just sentimental?
Yes, it is. It is. Because actually, let's think of it this way. This is climate change. You want to have the same animals and birds and plants as you saw all along, but climate change is upon you and they're all migrating north and doing funny things. It's a bigger problem than just the sentimental, I want my language. The example I used, I think somewhere in my book was, it's like a little boy keeping a pet rat in a shoebox under his bed. He brings it out once a day and pets it and gives it some water and some food, puts it back in the box and puts it in. One day the rat dies. That's not how rats were supposed to live, for sentimental reasons, so that a boy feels he's got a pet. So languages are going to exist. They have their own way.
So you don't think a language can be protected, like it's just going to go on its own course, which is going to be determined by economics, politics, all of that?
Yeah. It's like saying that you will not change your appearance by putting makeup on the mirror. You have to put it on yourself. So the language is just the mirror. The real thing is what's looking in the mirror, and that's the economics, the politics, all these things. History.
So we'll just have to accept it like the drying of a river, which is inevitable, unless something happens which changes, like the political dynamics changes or something of the sort. But we do see like in some spheres a sort of resurgence of the regional tongues, like languages like that were suppressed for a long time, are sort of reasserting with the emergence of social media and all. We see so much content being produced in Bhojpuri. There's efforts going on to even revive languages like Kodava, which many people don't even know about. And there's tons of like people have started reading books in Hindi again. There's publishing taking place in Hindi novels, and of course South Indian language movies and songs getting recognized at a global level. This is making what I feel is like a lot of people are now proud to speak in their local language, which they were probably not maybe 40-50 years ago. Even like somebody whose mother tongue is Haryanvi or something, they would confine it to a domestic sphere earlier and speak in Hindi earlier, but now they're very proud of their language. So there is a counter effect. Do you think that as India gets richer, people will need something to feel proud about, like they look back and require like something to give them cultural pride.
I think Indians are too busy living to worry about that. It's NRIs who need to feel proud and in very funny ways. No, what you're saying is a start, but it's only a start, because having a good pop culture and a literature is not enough. For a language to really do well, it has to engage with science and technology, futuristic things, the banking sector, all the modern things that we are doing in English now. You have to be able to do them in local languages. So that is the ultimate thing. But where is that going to go? You're basically going to be creating a language which is competitive, right? So what happens when you have something that is off life support and doing well? You start having things like the Gir lions going for a walk on the streets of Rajkot, because why not? We're not an endangered species anymore. Are you ready for a world where all the things you took for granted as your safety, that, we would like to have all the tribal languages, but let them not come and walk on our streets and push us off the streets. So we haven't considered what all is in the offing. We just want to have them around so we can say we didn't kill them, like the rat in the shoebox. We have to do a lot of thinking. And what will happen without us. We don't know enough to push things in too many directions, but the economy will do it. When we had a lockdown and people stopped going out, the world could have turned in a completely different direction then, and us started having very local contacts in our neighborhoods. It died out, that moment. But those are the things that actually make the change, not...
So there's some little initiatives being done at the education, on the educational side. The new education policy requires primary, or at least encourages primary education in local language. I think in UP, they probably implemented it for government schools.
Yeah.
You think these things will make tiny differences, but it's not. But unless the economic drivers...
No, they'll work. They're important. They have to be done. But like I did talk to someone in the ministry and asked, well, what is needed? I said, if you want to do any English medium education anywhere, you have to write the textbook bilingually. You have to think of it not as teaching in Hindi medium or teaching in Bengali medium, but as a bilingual thing, if you are eventually going to push them into English. So the teacher needs to know what's going on in the class. You can't give the teacher a book that he or she doesn't understand. So again, all these things have to be worked out.
And unless like they have books on physics and quantum mechanics and all of that in Hindi or the other languages, there is no point, because even if, yes, you teach me Premchand and all in Hindi, but then the minute I have to talk about anything technical, I have to switch to English. And that's not the case, actually. If we look at a lot of the, well, let's start with European countries. Countries like, for example, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Latvia, Estonia, none of these countries really have any economic value to their languages, if you think about it. But an economic value has been created in those languages by political reasons. So politically, their languages have been made the medium for everything, from government documents to government jobs to everything. And these people are bilingual. They do learn English, which has economic value globally, but there is an artificially constructed economic value to their language in their own country.
But there's a difference. First of all, remember, English is not in India to engage with the outside world. English is in India to make a statement about the class system of India, right? So we could have all these other things and do, I don't know how we do it. We are a heterogeneous country. Iceland has everything done in Icelandic, and they learn English as much as they need. But we are not in that situation. Firstly, we have other languages, and we have to deal with the fact that our relationship with English is a very old form of elitism that has been with us since the time of Sanskrit. English has merely replaced Sanskrit and Persian.
We always elite language with us. We
Yes.
just an elite language.
So we have to think of that.
But that gives me some optimism. Because like you said, in Sanskrit, at one point, Indian languages were overshadowed by the politically and culturally dominant Sanskrit, and then it was Persian far later.
And English.
And now in English. But in the previous two instances, our in the Indian languages re-emerged from that dominance. That did not kill them ultimately. Like, for example, like you were talking about the 10th century when literature started being produced in Kannada and Telugu and all, and there was like a whole re-emergence. I don't know what political drivers were at play.
Not so much literature, but initially very secular business type work. You know, I need my stock lists written. I need legal issues resolved. You want to write a legal brief. So it was quite different from the kind of stuff that was done earlier in Sanskrit.
And the way we think about English today is not so different. Like, this was surprising to me learning in history that Persian was pretty much at the same status back 1,000 years. That English enjoys today. Like, to look learned and intelligent, people had to be, regardless of their religion, people had to be Parsi, learned in Farsi. And they were learning all the literature of Ferdowsi and all of the great Persian poets, just like today Indians claim that, oh, I've read all the Shakespeare's or Dickens and whatnot.
You don't have to go that far back. Mohan Singh, when you see him in front of the teleprompter, he was in pain reading Devanagari. The minute it was in Urdu script, remember? That's not very long ago. The man is there. He's still alive. He's from a generation where a good Sikh gentleman or Hindu gentleman from that kind of class would have learned first the Urdu script and Persian also. It's not so long ago.
And interestingly, I was reading that when Shivaji had decided to have like a Sanskrit vocabulary, Sanskritized vocabulary for his so-called Hindu empire, when he decided to give it that shape and form, he actually commissioned a dictionary. But in the dictionary, for all the Sanskritized words, which he knew that his most of his people would have no clue about, they would be completely unfamiliar with, he had the meanings for them in Farsi, in Persian, because he knew that majority of people. So Sanskrit was so prominent that that sort of the educated people, even down all the way down in Maharashtra, would be far more familiar and comfortable with the Persian words. It's almost like if somebody is trying to teach Sanskritized words today, they would probably have the meanings in English for the urban elite in India, or not even the elite today, for literally urban people in India. So, but the optimism I was saying is like Persian was that dominant over India, and now it's disappeared without a trace. We don't have any clue. Where did Persian go? Like, most people would say that Persian in India, no, it's a language in Persia. We have no clue about it. They don't even realize how important it was that an Indian did not look like an Indian, could not come across as an educated person without knowing Persian. And India was producing far more literature in Persian than the entire Persia did. And now it's gone without a trace. Just as Sanskrit is gone without, well, Sanskrit is there in text, but it's really disappeared. I think 14,000 people speak Sanskrit now. So
they think they do, but let's put it this very, very simply. Once upon a time, the Brahmins and the kings ruled, so you had Sanskrit and Prakrit. Later on, the Mughals, the Sultanate ruled, you had Persian. The British came and they brought English, and nothing changed. But it's not about the Brits now. And Persian is not the Persian was never about Iranians.
Yes.
It was always about the Mughals, who became mostly Indian.
The Indian elite,
yes. So the point being, it was never Iranians.
And it's now the Indian elite who choose to speak in English. So, but I'm just saying there could be a repeat of the same. Indian languages have shown immense resilience over the millennia.
It could happen. It's just simply that we don't know the future. But as I said, when we had the lockdown, we never imagined in our lifetime we would see such sudden change, and change that all kinds of change could happen. Supposing the economy crashes, supposing the US economy crashes and the dollar is replaced by the yuan, what is going to happen? This is going to have a tremendous impact on people pushing towards Chinese as a second language, English would remain in India for its own reasons, unless people said that suddenly a new breed of India, the demographic dividend, suddenly say, we want to be technicians, we want to be technologists, we don't want to be manual laborers. Then something would happen. It could be very good, it could be very positive, but it would take something as wide-ranging as a whole recasting of how we do our economy or research or technology. It could happen. I mean, people like me kind of hope it will happen.
For sentimental reasons.
Huh?
For sentimental.
Not for sentimental reasons. I think it's healthier for the country if poor people are not laborers, but are involved in technology.
Oh, from a more egalitarian reasons,
Yeah.
yes. Got you. Yeah. But you don't, some people think English or some kind of pidgin mix is the way to, like, is likely to be the case. Do you see that?
It's happening. Maybe that's how it happened. Maybe that's how Prakrits found their way into modern languages. That's a thought that's crossed my mind. Right. Except that with English, it's not just nouns, it's huge chunks. And it's something that we looked at a bit once in class. Is that the way that English is going to percolate into the languages? Now, when you want to listen to something in Malayalam, there are enough English words, as there were Sanskrit words before, that you will not be lost. So is that the way to go? Is India going to be a country where for traveling and not traveling to a different place every year, we're going to find that understanding something 80% is adequate? That's a question that's in my mind. If you understand Malayalam 80%, is that good enough if you don't live there? Could be. It's another option, because all parts of India have their something-ish English.
No, it's interesting that we are part of this ongoing process that's been going on for millennia. And you were studying what happened in the past, but we are living through it. This is happening every day.
We are at another inflection point right now. Yeah.
Yes,
which
exactly.
Could go anyway. It's exciting.
Yes. Okay. Well, this was terrific. I really enjoyed this conversation, Dr. Mohan. There's so much we covered today, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And all the best for your next book. We'll be looking forward to it. And once it's out, we'd love to have a conversation about that.
Absolutely. I'd love it.
Thank you. And signing off on Argumentative Indians. Thank you to everyone joining us. And